A Whisper in the Ear. It was April 1917. A year and a half had passed since Will Bird joined the 42nd Battalion, the Canadian Highlanders, who later became part of the legendary regiment of the British Army known as the Black Watch. The Germans had dubbed them Ladies from Hell, likely due to the kilts the battalion wore while charging into battle to the droning blare of their bagpipes. The Germans hated these guys. Since the beginning of the war, the German army had successfully held a 4.5-mile-long escarpment along the border between France and Belgium known as Vimy Ridge. Will and the 42nd Battalion needed to take that high ground away from the Germans, and over 3 days that April, they and the entire coalition of Canadian forces slowly made their way up. A constant bombardment of German shells thundered over the heads of the advancing Allied forces as Will and 2 of his platoon mates spent grueling days digging trenches and laying barbed wire near the front lines of the fighting. It was well past midnight of the second day when Will and the others had reached their exhaustion point. They called it quits and threw themselves into a cold, muddy trench to attempt to get some sleep. Winter was barely past, and the night air bore with it that feeling of being too warm for winter, yet too cold for spring. The mud and clay were churned up, and the best a soldier could do was wrap up in his trench coat and hug himself for warmth while dreaming of a warm day in the sunny Nova Scotian field back home. Will had seen better days, to be sure, but he was simply too tired to think much about it. He fell fast asleep, wrapped in his coat, huddled beneath a makeshift tent, tied down at the corners to ward off the wind and retain some scraps of warmth for Will and his 2 fellow soldiers. At some point in the night, the wind took one of the corners of the tent and whipped it free. It brushed across Will's face and woke him. In that same moment, a warm hand grasped his right hand and pulled at him while another warm hand grabbed his left and yanked him to his feet. Startled to groggy wakefulness, Will thought it was one of his comrades who had pulled him up. But when he got a look into the face of his dead-of-the-night visitor, it was someone much more familiar. It was Steve, his little brother Steve, who had died 18 months earlier. This was no stupor-induced delusion or fitful, freakish nightmare brought on by the rigors of battle. It was live and in the moment real. Steve, dressed in a clean, crisp uniform, leaned into Will and spoke softly with brotherly familiarity. "Get your gear," Steve whispered. "Follow me." He paused for a moment, then turned and started down the trench with some sense of urgency. Will was simply too shocked to speak. He did as his brother asked, grabbing his gear and following Steve through the trenches and makeshift shelters constructed by other soldiers from his platoon. At one point, Will lost his grip and dropped the gear that he had thrown hastily over his shoulder. When he stooped down to pick it up, he saw Steve several paces ahead enter a passageway off the trench. Will threw his gear back over his shoulder and hurriedly followed after Steve, but his brother was nowhere to be seen. The passageway split to the left and right, and Will had no idea which direction his brother had turned. He decided to try to the right. He could not see Steve, so he doubled back and went to the left. Still, he could not find him. Steve had vanished completely. Tired and now sweating, Will leaned up against a wall in the passageway, overtaken by exhaustion. Standing there upright, his face against the muddy wall, he fell back to sleep. "What are you doing here?" a voice cracked out of the dark, snapping Will abruptly out of his sleep. He was still standing against the wall of the passageway. A fellow soldier from his platoon was shaking him. "What are you doing here, man?" the soldier repeated. Will hadn't yet come to his full senses when the soldier told him that part of the trench had been hit directly by a German shell. They were working to dig it out, but all they could find was bits of equipment and bloody body parts. Will hurriedly accompanied the other soldier to help dig out the trench when he realized, to his horror, that it was the very spot where he had been sleeping. If Will had remained there a few minutes longer, it would have been his arms and legs found in the debris. Will's brother had saved his life. Will was stunned. He told the soldier and eventually the rest of his platoon about the visitation from his brother. No one was sure what to believe, and many of the lads were skeptical, thinking Will had simply walked off in his sleep and dreamt the whole thing. Was that truly the spirit of my brother? Will asked himself. Did he have some providential foreknowledge that I would die in that muddy trench? Will pushed these musings out of his mind. All he knew for sure was that Steve was watching over him and had found some way to wake him, touch him with warm hands, and whisper in his ear. The very next day, the Allies took Vimy Ridge. The victory marked an auspicious turn in the conflict, becoming a symbol of the unified Allied efforts that would eventually win the war. Will would fight on till the end with the 42nd Battalion.